pantomime season hasn't come early. It's here year-round. Not in the theatres, but everywhere else. The USA now has much of the appearance of, if not a panto, then a desperate soap opera, one of those daytime efforts. Mostly ridiculous characters and a script cobbled together from jokes from unseasonal Christmas crackers. Politicians who lecture their citizens and the wider world about democracy night and day have, metaphorically at least, bumped off their own president, dropping him, apparently against his will, or what remains of his will in that demonstrably ruined brain, as their candidate for the upcoming election. The US Democratic Party has thereby done away with democracy, surely negating the legitimacy of its own existence. In a time when democracy is said to be threatened as never before, when democracy is said to be the be-all and end-all of civilization, the Democratic Party high-ups simply did away with the man they had insisted was their democratically chosen candidate, being their own President Joe Biden, suddenly identified as not fit for purpose. After years of stumbling and mumbling as dementia rose around him like floodwater, and replacing him with a woman no one wants in power or ever wanted. Biden doesn't seem to have been removed because he has dementia. Rather, it had to be done only because too many ordinary people had finally found his dementia impossible to overlook any longer, impossible to deny. That move followed the attempted shooting of President Donald Trump, of course. For the most powerful nation on earth, to lose one contender for the top job might be bad luck, but to come within a hair's breadth of losing both in the same week looks downright careless. It also appeared brazen, the self-appointed elite showing who's boss. Without so much as a by your leave, you might say, Biden's name has been erased from the ticket and laughing-gas Kamala Harris's name has been scribbled in its place. And on a dime, the same politicians and mainstream media talking heads who only weeks ago were assuring audiences Biden was as sharp as a tack are now all in for Kamala, voted for by no one. Commentators more seasoned than me have pointed out that if those events had unfolded in a country so-called Democrats didn't like, Russia maybe, they'd be shouting from the rooftops about a coup, which is effectively what it was. Whatever else, it all looks ludicrous, or perhaps downright sinister. The deep state, the Leviathan, whatever you want to call the entity running things, has had no option but to come to the surface where all can see it. It had to surface, in desperation perhaps, to carry out blatant acts of tyranny before sinking into the depths once more. That descent into the darkness, out of sight, might best be obscured, covered up by something eye-catchingly catastrophic. A world war, maybe. On the other side of the aisle, Donald Trump has announced as his running mate J.D. Vance, a senator from Ohio, a former Marine, a successful author and businessman, a lawyer, praised by union leaders for standing up for the workers. Vance also has ties to Peter Thiel, entrepreneur, billionaire and all-round Svengali by all accounts, the man behind PayPal and, more recently, Palantir, a private company backed by the CIA that harvests data about citizens, spying on them to an extent George Orwell's Big Brother could scarcely have dreamt of. Vance and Trump have called for an end of the war in Ukraine, sure enough, but there's plenty more war where that came from, out with the old, in with the new. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu received several ovations in the Capitol building in Washington this week in front of a joint session of Congress. Politicians, most of whom have undeniable ties to AIPAC, being the Israeli lobby. Netanyahu told Republicans and Democrats alike that the war in Gaza was America's war, as well as Israel's. He said that Iran is America's most radical and murderous enemy. He told protesters, many holding placards declaring him a wanted war criminal in reference to an arrest warrant sought by the International Criminal Court, that they were Iran's useful idiots. Whispers are already circulating that the so-called lone shooter in Pennsylvania, the jeans and t-shirt clad 20-year-old without an online presence or much of a past at all, who apparently came within a whisker of the killing that might have ignited a civil war in America. Speculation that he was an asset of, guess where? Iran. Anyone spotting a pattern here? As one war closes, another one opens, just in time. These are black days, bloody days. Is there anyone anywhere near the levers of power who prefers peace to war? Here in Britain, we've got the head of the army, General Sir Rowley Walker, telling anyone who'll listen that we have to be ready to fight Russia, China, Iran and North Korea, what he called an axis of upheaval in 3 years' time. War is peace, as we were told by the Uniparty in George Orwell's 1984. Also, freedom is slavery and ignorance is strength, although Orwell meant it all as a warning, not an instruction manual. The sense of chaos, destruction and impending doom is so pervasive now, it's hard not to draw the conclusion it's all just fakery. Confected fear porn designed and rolled out so as to get the herd stampeding once more, get them panicked and keep them panicked. American journalist H.L. Mencken said, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. Wherever else we are now, however close we might be to catastrophe of one sort or another, global war, economic collapse, cyber attack, aliens from Mars, who knows, we're surely approaching peak fear-mongering. The threat of the sort of chaos that hurts the billions of regular people and enriches and empowers that relative handful of already rich and powerful. The evidence is everywhere." In his novel Blood Meridian, Cormac McCarthy said, "War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him, the ultimate trade, awaiting its ultimate practitioner." We have now, if not the ultimate practitioners of war, certainly the most enthusiastic and committed we've seen for a while. War in Ukraine has been going on for more than 2 years. Counts of the dead there vary from the tens of thousands to well over 500,000, and the gears of the meat grinder are still mindlessly, cheerfully whirling. A report published in The Lancet earlier this month predicted a death toll in Gaza in excess of 186,000 people, most of them women and children. There are presently 45 armed conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, 35 elsewhere in Africa, 21 in Asia, 7 in Europe and 6 in Latin America. The US has as many general officers in service today as it had during World War II, when its armed forces totalled 14 million fighting men. NATO's senior military figure, Admiral Rob Bauer, has urged a whole-of-society approach to war against Russia. Here in Britain and in the USA, politicians with a taste for war raise the spectre of citizen armies, which surely means, in the end, conscription for the citizens of both countries, our children. American Major General Smedley Butler was that nation's most decorated Marine when he died in 1940. He said war's a racket and always had been. He said it was the most profitable racket, the most vicious, in which profits are counted in dollars and losses in lives and bodies. And here we are in 2024, when some of the wealthiest and therefore the most influential people in the world, because money talks, a few people made wealthier beyond imagining in the last 2 or 3 years alone, a time that has seen the greatest transfer of wealth from poor to rich in history. When some of those people preach that there are too many people in the world anyway. Birth rates fall all around the world. Entire populations are failing to make enough babies even to continue their existences. And yet those among us with the loudest voices preach population reduction. The eugenicists, the Malthusians, those behind Agenda 2030, transhumanism and the like, are never far away and always anti-human to the marrow of their bones. War will cut the numbers efficiently in a single, hot, bright moment if the war hawks get their way and the nuclear missiles fly. The internet is awash with a meme bearing a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. Whether he said the words or not, the sentiment sounds about right. "I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Here's the thing. I heard someone say this week that when the Leviathan is exposed, it's because something somewhere has gone badly wrong with the plan. When the political elites in America have no option but to drop the mask and reveal themselves for what they are, what it's all about, which is power, it's only desperate measures to prevent that power slipping from their grasp. When it's so obviously not about preserving democracy or respecting, far less acting upon the will of the people. When their intentions are so barefacedly corrupt, when their ambition is so plain to see, when all roads lead to money and war, we must ask, again, what are we supposed to be contemplating sending our children off to war to fight for? I'm joined for today's show by writer and podcaster Tom Buick. It's some world at the moment, Tom. I mean, we've just had chaos in Paris before the opening of the Olympics even. We've had the Trump shooting. We've had Biden getting dropped from the ticket. We've had Kamala Harris suddenly thrust before us. It just feels like one crisis after another, which starts to feel like somebody's plan.
And only your expert drafting, I think, can capture that sheer complexity in a single monograph. But really what I was struck by as you were speaking there, Neil, was this sort of sense, actually something John F. Kennedy famously said, that we've got nothing to fear but fear itself. And maybe we've got to a point in our political discourse, certainly in this country, in America, and other parts of the world, where that narrative of fear now is front and centre. And I do think some of it is justified. I mean, as you know, you and I take a different position, I think, on the war in Ukraine. To paraphrase, you sort of talked about it's the warmongers, it's the people really interested in the sort of military complex, potentially sacrificing the young flowering of youth. And of course, that is absolutely one of the horrible consequences of war. But take Ukraine, for example. I don't see the West has any other choice than to back Ukraine to the hilt. This recent security conference that took place, the European political community, something the Danish Prime Minister said about the need to ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose this war. It's not just about their territorial integrity, in my view. It's about the underlying tenets of Western civilization that has been in the ascendancy, let's be honest, for about 400 years now. I mean, the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire had a similar tenure of ascendancy. We're in a period, we're living through a period where we're unsure whether the West will continue with its values and its morals to have that kind of ascendancy.
But does it have the right? I mean, I ask you again, didn't NATO pick this fight with Russia? Instead of this nonsense about Putin being the provocateur and the aggressor, wasn't he left with no option?
Where I can find some common cause with you on that question is, has the West acted too late, too little, too late on a situation that was unfolding even before the annexation of Crimea in 2014? Agreeing things like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline within 2 years of Putin's aggression, annexing the sovereign territory of a European country on our own continent. So, of course, in hindsight, there are lots of questions for our political elites, and you're right to highlight them. But I put the question sort of back to you in a sense, which is, what alternative do we have? Because,
I'll tell you an alternative. An alternative would have been, if we truly believed in democracy, we wouldn't be standing behind an America that provoked a coup. That deposed a democratically elected president in the Ukraine, which was ultimately, in relatively recent terms, what triggered all of this. I'm going to have to go into a break, though, Tom, because we can pick this up. Next on the programme, what impact could the presidential race have on US foreign policy? Could the outcome increase the chance of global conflicts? I'll be asking Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, it's been a week of manoeuvring by the US presidential candidates, but how might the outcome of the US election affect the rest of us around the world? Wars back in Europe, has been for the last 2 years. How long before we are drawn into conflict here, there and everywhere? Who better to discuss such matters than with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a combat veteran and a former White House advisor. Good evening, Colonel. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you.
So many shenanigans, so much malarkey in US politics at the moment. Is America poised to choose one of two very different destinies? What with backing Kamala Harris or perhaps Donald Trump? Who knows which of them will get into the White House? Are we dealing with I don't know Schrodinger's White House at the moment, with a cat both alive and dead in there at the same time?
No, I think that's a good analogy. Actually, there are three candidates, including RFK Jr., Bobby Kennedy Jr.
For sure.
And he's really fundamentally different from the other two. The two do tend to blend into one sometimes. Clearly, at this point, The Israelis and the Jewish lobby inside the United States strongly favor Trump as being the one they are convinced will back Israel's war with Iran. Not just the invasion of southern Lebanon, but when it spreads to Iran, they're convinced that Trump will support that. At the same time, you have the issue in Ukraine. Trump would like to see that end, but he hasn't explained how he would do it, what steps he would take. For that matter, on the other side, there doesn't seem to be any interest in ending anything in Ukraine, but they are talking about a two-state solution in the Middle East. I think the only one who is universally committed to building peace as opposed to prosecuting war is Bobby Kennedy Jr. So it's not a good picture right now in the United States, because at least 2/3 of the candidates are both committed one way or another to continued hostilities.
Does anyone, though, really convincingly have their foot on the brake or anywhere near the brake pedal? I mean, you say, you're right, of course, to say that Bobby Kennedy Jr. is the third credible candidate, but he has the noises I've heard him making are again what we always hear, which is about absolutely backing Israel. So it doesn't necessarily feel that there would be any inclination there to back off from conflict in that perennial hotspot.
Well, I think all of the candidates are intimidated by Jewish money and power inside the United States and the West. I think you have a similar problem in Great Britain. People are unwilling to speak out against the Israeli behavior in Gaza and their passion for widening the war because they're afraid of being called anti-Semites, but more important, they're afraid of losing financial support. It's that simple. If you watched Netanyahu speak here, he received 58 standing ovations in the space of 55 minutes. Frankly, his speech wasn't that good, but everyone is clapping vigorously who attended because they want the money to continue to flow to them. I think there's something else, Neil, that's worth mentioning, though, for your audience, and that is that we could have a very serious crisis here at home in the near term in the White House itself. Now, Kamala Harris is going to carry the standard for the Democrats, but there's a real possibility that President Biden may resign, or worse, that he could actually pass away. He's not in good shape physically at all. If that were to happen, we would be in a crisis similar to what happened when Richard Nixon was president. He replaced his vice president initially, and then subsequently he had to resign. And he had to be replaced by a vice president. And again, we had to pick a new one. And that requires the House and the Senate to essentially confirm or reject whomever the president happens to be at the time and nominates for vice president. I mention this because the leadership in the United States is very, very fluid at the moment. People don't have a great deal of confidence in President Harris. And frankly, not a lot of people had much confidence in President Biden. So I think that picture is going to continue, at least into the fall.
Bear with me, Colonel. My guest here in the studio, Tom Pugh, I felt you nodding or definitely giving some body language indication that you were interested to respond to what the Colonel was saying there.
Yeah, I must take issue with tropes like Jewish money's driving US foreign policy, Neil. I don't think that's helpful, actually, in a debate like this. Where I think we do need to have a debate, of course, is with the actions of the Israeli government over many decades, not, for example, adhering to UN Security Council resolutions on the occupied territories. I think we'll be talking some more about that on the show. But I think what's unfolding in the US is actually democracy, in the sense that people can see, as you said in your monologue, that we've got a president of the United States who's not capable really to do his job. And yes, you could argue it's a coup, but effectively, under the Constitution, that is completely in order, isn't it? And, Kamala Harris, as the vice president anyway, would step in the event of what Colonel McGregor's talking about, in the event that Joe Biden couldn't do his job.
I think you'd have to be playing pretty fast and loose with the concept of democracy to say that, just bumping him, the democratically made choice of candidate off of the ballot, bringing somebody else in without so much as a vote, and then to invoke that as democracy in action. I mean,
but Neil, but how many prime ministers have we had in the last 5 years?
I would hardly hold that up as a that's not.
But what I'm saying is, within, we're a parliamentary democracy. The States is a constitutional republic. All I'm trying to say to you is that, we could say we don't agree with it, we don't think it's right, but I think it's a bit strong to say it's a coup when people are operating within the parliament, within the constitutional system.
What do you say, Colonel? Also, obviously, Tom Butte there, takes issue with your suggestion that it would be Jewish money, but for me, I don't understand why anyone should be able to stand behind anything as some sort of invisible shield against being criticised for actions. So if people are behaving badly, to me, it doesn't matter who or what they are.
Well, honesty
you call
is
it the
probably
behaviour.
more important than any other single factor if you're going to have a debate about anything. Well, I don't know if you could hear me or not. I think honesty is preeminently important in any debate. We need to be honest about where the money is coming from, where the billions of dollars are located, and who is putting these vast sums of money against policy options. Remember, against the backdrop of our open borders, all of this business overseas, frankly, from the standpoint of most Americans, is not terribly important. We're talking today about potential for war with Russia in Eastern Europe and the potential for a widening war in the Middle East that could bring in Iran and ultimately Russia and even China and other countries. These are very serious matters, but inside the United States, people are preeminently concerned about the open borders, the rising criminality, inflation, the deterioration in our economic capacity. But most importantly, the fact that we have over 52 million people living inside our country who are not born here. Those things may not seem terribly important to you in Europe, but for us, those issues are far, far more important than anything happening anywhere else. And, I also take issue with this notion that somehow or another Russia is the aggressor. It absolutely is not. And we can trace this back. We can go back as far as you would like, but certainly with 2008, with the decision to say that Ukraine would eventually join NATO when it was abundantly clear to everyone, your own ambassadors, our ambassadors, that was an act of war for all intents and purposes that Russia would answer. And indeed, we kept up that pressure, and we did stage a coup. The CIA, with the help of MI6, put in a government that was hostile to Russia. The Russians acted prudently in defense of their country, in favor of their own national security. And they have restricted, and I would argue exercised tremendous restraint in what they've been doing in eastern Ukraine. For all this nonsense about Russia's interest in attacking NATO, there is none. But NATO has made it abundantly clear that it is aggressive and hostile to Russia. Why else would we be interested in Ukraine?
Colonel McGregor, as always, I'm only beaten by time here. I just have to get to another bulletin. But again, thank you so much for your insight. And this is a conversation that I hope we can keep on having. It's of the utmost importance on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you so much, Colonel McGregor. Next on the programme, political analyst Garland Nixon will be here to help us assess the state of the presidential race and tell us who is in charge of the United States right now. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back, lovely people, to The Neil Oliver Show. Now, the race to become the so-called leader of the free world took another twist last week when President Joe Biden decided he would not be running for re-election. So we're told Biden has endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris, who now looks poised to take on Republican candidate Donald Trump in what's likely to be a bitter and hard-fought contest over the next few months. I'm joined now to discuss all of this by Garland Nixon, a radio talk show host and political analyst in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to see you there. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is a fascinating period in American history through which we are living, is it not? What was your gut reaction to the pivot from sharp as a tack, ready for anything Joe Biden to sidelining him, and now all guns blazing with Kamala Harris that it wouldn't appear many people particularly want?
Well, I had argued for quite some time now that the primary process demonstrated that, or the lack thereof of a process, demonstrated that the Democratic Party understood that they were going to have to replace Joe Biden. I didn't think it was, I thought it was remarkable that during the primary they said we're going to have no debates, so they didn't expose Joe Biden to any scrutiny about his cognitive decline during the debate. In many states, there were up to 3 other candidates who were registered Democrats who had done everything within the confines and standards of the process to become bona fide and certified candidates who were not on the ballot. There were a number of states where they just said, Joe Biden's the only name we're going to put on the ballot. We're not going to put any more names on the ballot. So I had argued all along there was a setup so that when they decided to replace Joe Biden, there would be no one in second place who could claim, okay, well, you have to give it to me. And simply the ruling elite, the leaders, the elites of the Democratic Party could choose someone of their choosing. That ended up being Kamala Harris. And I certainly suspect that they will be extremely sorry in the long run that they picked her.
It's an alarming irony, to put it mildly, that a so-called Democratic Party is operating in this way. What is democratic inherently about the way in which they have sought to get their own way? And by they, I mean the high-ups, the high panjandrum. Again,
I think these things, I hate to sound like I'm blowing my own horn, but some of these things had become obvious to me. I had argued after the 2020 election, the Democratic Party could no longer have a democratic process. They could not afford the luxury of a democratic process now because there's so much corruption and because the party is so misaligned from the wants and needs of the working class people in their party that they could not allow those people to choose the candidate. In 2016, Donna Brazile wrote a book, and she was the chair of the Democratic Party. She wrote a book in which she admitted the process was rigged. Recently, Representative Adam Smith came out on I believe it was MSNBC, and said, we chose Joe Biden in 2020. He was selected not because he could beat Donald Trump, but because he could beat Bernie Sanders. The party was more concerned about an attack from the left than they were anything on the right. They'd far rather have Donald Trump than they would a left-leaning candidate or allow their constituency to actually choose the candidate. They can't afford that anymore. So any thought of democracy, it's in words only. It's the party now is straight out totalitarian and elite ruled top down.
Ought we to invoke the C word, by which I mean coup? Would you say that Joe Biden has been forced out in a style that were happening in any other place, a country that they didn't like, maybe Russia, that they'd have been shouting coup from the rooftops?
Well, I would argue that it wasn't a coup because a coup implies that power was seized in an extra democratic process, or power was seized in a process that is not normally the process for that particular entity. In order for there to have been a coup, that would mean that the people of the party had some input in the power structure of the party. And since, as we could see by, any numerous issues, I could go with Medicare for all, where 80% of Democrats are in favor of Medicare for all. In fact, no, let me change that. It was 87%. Are in favor of Medicare for all, of a national health system, and the 13% that ruled the party said no. I could go on and on, wherein with polling numbers that show that the party elite, the rulership of the party, is completely separated from its constituency, and so therefore there was no power to be taken. They already basically all they did was they did away with the illusion that they were putting forth of democracy. And now it's pretty clear straight out that they're not even going to pretend anymore.
Bear with me, Garland Nixon, Tom Buick. You're smiling, you're nodding. I think is that along with the idea that this was not a coup and that there was some sad wraith-like shadow of democratic process here?
I was pleased to hear that because that absolutely accords with my view that this wasn't a coup. But I would also agree with the second part of that response, which is, we've seen it here in our own democracy. We go through the illusion of democracy when you've got very powerful technocratic elites that sit behind these people. And it's really when that herd moves that we see things moving. I mean, what I actually really find extraordinary about the whole Biden affair is that it has taken this long for him to be, in effect, removed from office in 6 months, 7 months' time. That it took that long, that the gaslighting that we've been subjected to about his cognitive decline, that we've sort of fallen for it. Well, we didn't fall for it, but, it's gone on that long. But I think it comes back to this core question, really, about political parties on both sides of the pond and the extent to which they are really now rooted in their core values. I mean, we've got a Labour Party in government now that arguably is more detached than ever from its working class roots. In fact, fewer working class people voted for the Labour Party than other social groups.
Indeed. Garland Nixon, I can't have you here without inviting you to contemplate what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. Is it just me, or are we being, as a general population, invited to move on very, very quickly from whatever happened there? There doesn't, given the extremity of what happened, the news schedule seems to have moved away from it very quickly without really arriving at any kind of a meaningful assessment. What's your gut instinct about the best way to assess what happened that day?
Well, the problem we have in Butler, Pennsylvania, is that it's kind of like a philosophy class. Every question that comes up, brings up 10 more questions. I mean, we now find out that the Secret Service, that the government, turned down a drone. They didn't want a drone, but yet the perpetrator, the apparent perpetrator of the crime, was able to fly a drone around for several hours. The more you look at it, it becomes like the Keystone Cops. It's like a comedy of errors. So the questions that arise from this incident in the context of a historical, a country where historically we have ample evidence that the intelligence agencies committed murders of a president, of a president to be on the campaign trail, such as this, of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, name after name after name. I would argue it is prudent to assume that there was, some nefarious, diabolical intent here, even if there weren't. I think it's fair for people to make the assumption. And those who may be Democrats who say, no, it's not possible. Certainly, if the same thing happened to Joe Biden and the roles were reversed, they would say, yeah, I think somebody's up to no good. So the more we look into this, the more it becomes apparent that there are questions that can't be answered. And then you start asking yourself, an incident of this nature or the incident of this level, this would normally be 24-hour news cycle nonstop. And every time a question was brought up, the news media would look into it with an electron microscope instead of now, it's everything but they want to talk about everything except that. It's all Kamala Harris all the time now.
So it's brushed under the carpet because it was an inside job. Can I take that from what you're saying?
Which is ridiculous.
Well, we have to be reasonable and say we can't come to a conclusion that it is an inside job at this point. But we cannot laugh anyone out of the room who strongly suspects that it was an inside job.
Garland Nixon, thank you so much for your insight this evening. I'll hope to continue this conversation with you in another time and place. Coming up next, we will ask what impact the International Court of Justice's ruling last week against Israel may have on the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back once more to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, the International Court of Justice ruled this week that Israel's settlement policy in occupied Palestinian territories is in breach of international law, unlawful. A panel of 15 judges concluded that the transfer by Israel of settlers to the West Bank and Jerusalem, as well as Israel's maintenance of their presence, is contrary to Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So, what next for the benighted, war-torn region? I'm joined now by United States podcast host Kim Iverson. Good afternoon, Kim. Lovely to see you there.
Thank you. Good morning. It's morning for me.
Good morning to you.
Great to be here.
I've been paying attention to what you've had to say in very recent times about events in Gaza, events in that war-torn place. I wonder if I could just get you to react to that International Court of Justice ruling about the unlawful nature of the activities of the settlers there.
Yeah, interestingly, this is coming 56 years too late. I mean, I'm glad it's happening now. It's just that it is really unfortunate, and it's really something we should question is why it took so long for them to come to this conclusion. This is something the Palestinian people have been saying since the occupation in 1967, that they're under duress, that this is not a military occupation for the safety of Israel, that this is instead an ethnic cleansing campaign with the intent to take the land. And they've been saying this, and over the decades, Israel has encroached on their land, taken more of their land, has confiscated their resources, has diverted their resources to the Israeli people and away from the Palestinian people. And finally now, I think the world is catching up, largely because of the internet, people being able to see what is happening, and that raising such high levels of alarm that finally the ICJ stepped in and said, hey, wait a minute, you guys cannot be doing this. This is not a military occupation. This is clearly a project, a long-term project. So I'm glad they're doing it. I think that this is going to wake up a lot of the world. It is just very interesting that it came. I mean, they're saying that this occupation began in 1967. Here we are in 2024. Do
you think the ruling will end up growing any teeth, be it in the United Nations or anywhere else? If we went back to 1974 and steps that were taken at that time to make South Africa a pariah on account of the apartheid system, would you have any confidence in anything actually being done to change the situation?
Yes, I probably similar to South Africa. I would imagine that the world now is looking at this ruling and saying, okay, what we suspected is now been affirmed. And so it would allow world leaders to step in a bit more and put more pressure on Israel. I don't know how much it's going to do here in the United States. Certainly, and my country is unfortunately the one that's really perpetuating this even further by arming and aiding Israel. And you saw Netanyahu just came here to this country and received tons of standing ovations. And so I don't know if it's going to make a lot of change within the politics here in the United States, but certainly the voting base is changing, and that is going to put pressure on the politicians. So maybe the rest of the world will be able to counter with the mighty weight of the world, might be able to counter the mighty weight of the United States with Israel. But we'll have to see if the pressure does actually amount to something.
It surely must become increasingly difficult for the United States. As you say, Netanyahu addressing a joint session in Congress, while large numbers of protesters were there in the vicinity making their feelings clear. When there is this a warrant sought for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, on the basis of crimes against humanity, for the United States to continue to be full-throated in its support must increasingly look controversial to the rest of the world.
It's certainly looking increasingly controversial here in this country, and this is the first time ever that this discussion has happened in this country. This country has been tried and true, very supportive of Israel. The population, everybody's just, all Americans pretty much just say, I support Israel. And that has been the blanket statement forever. But now, finally, the conversation is shifting. People are pointing out the fact that Congress is heavily bought by influence. There's a lot of money pouring in, a lot of American money pouring in support of building the nation of Israel rather than building our own country. And a lot of Americans are starting to question that. And as they see these atrocities that are being committed by Israel in real time on social media, people are then really starting to question the narratives that we were taught on our news programs from the time we were born, which is that Israel is this victim country surrounded by these terrorists that want to kill them. And now we're seeing with social media, that that narrative is not exactly true.
Bear with me, Kim. Tom Buick in the studio with me here in London. It is increasingly difficult. I wonder sometimes if it's been an unintended consequence of the most recent events that so many people now are talking about 1948, are invoking the Nakba, are questioning, at the very least, the way in which the state of Israel was founded. Because it does, as Kim was saying, it flies in the face of what we here on this side of the Atlantic were also invited to think. It's not a good look for Israel, is it? The unfolding horror in Gaza.
In terms of the unfolding horror across Gaza and indeed across the Middle East, it's not a good look, Neil, but it won't surprise you. I mean, I'll take issue, though, with your UN General Assembly point in 1948. The majority of sovereign nations voted to give the Jewish state a homeland. It's something that the British had promised long before it had a mandate in Palestine. So I don't think that's really particularly a fruitful argument to be reopening. I think what we have to get back to, and what I was disappointed in terms of the guest contribution, is putting all of the weight on Israel. Anyone who's been to Israel, and I haven't, I'm not Jewish, but I have Jewish friends who live in Israel. This is a democratic state that gives full rights to 2 million Arab Israelis. And it is a state that if you grow up there with your children, you feel besieged, not just by terrorists that are seeking to basically obliterate your way of life, but by proxy states around you who are fueling and aiding and abetting these terrorists. So I don't think it's as one-sided as our guest is making out. What we've got to get back to, I think, in our politics is a two-state solution where, as well as pressure on Israel and the Israeli government, there needs to be pressure on the Palestinian leadership, whatever that leadership is, because, of course, we've got a Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We've got a different leadership with the Palestinian Authority in West Bank. So when are we going to see the Palestinian leadership stepping up to the challenge of peace?
What say you, Kim? Tom Buick here in the studio saying about I was saying there in my question to Tom that a lot of questions have been asked, really for the first time in my lifetime, about the foundation of the State of Israel and everything since. Is there also a quid pro quo which would demand different behaviour from the Palestinian government?
I think that the Palestinians are rightfully angry, and they have I think it's reasonable for anybody to be. I mean, I understand that there was a mandate in 1948. I understand that was promised to the Jewish people. This had nothing to do with the Arab population that was there. It was the Germans. They should have given them part of Germany, but they didn't. They instead subjected them to an innocent group of people in the Middle East. And I understand the Jewish, the desire to go back to the homeland that they're reading about in their religious texts. But maybe it's maybe a fruitless conversation to go back to that. We should just focus on the here and now and what's happening to the Palestinian people. Although I do think the history of it matters to understand exactly how we got to the point where we are today. But just to counter a little bit, the Arab population inside of Israel, the Palestinians living inside of Israel, do not have equal rights. They have equal basic human rights, but they don't have the same equal national rights, meaning they're not allowed to marry somebody, and a Palestinian living inside of Israel is not allowed to marry a Palestinian that they meet, let's say, 20 minutes away in the West Bank and actually immigrate them into Israel. However, a Jewish Israeli is allowed to marry any Jew anywhere in the world who's never stepped foot in Israel, doesn't live anywhere near that land, and able to immigrate them and their entire families in. So they don't have the same rights. They don't have administrative detention for the Jewish Israelis, like what they have for the Arab Israelis happening right now, because they think that they might be aiding and abetting terrorists inside of Palestine. They're suspected terrorists. Practically all Arabs living inside of Israel are right now. So, I too have also been to Israel, and I've been to the West Bank, and I've traveled around with the Palestinians, going through the checkpoints, dealing with the military occupation there. And even if Israel does give, even if you want to argue that Israel gives 2 million people inside of Israel those rights, they are occupying another group of millions of people who they are not giving equal rights to. who live under completely different laws, and they're 100% under the subject of Israel. So it is incumbent upon Israel to make the change, not the Palestinian people.
Such a difficult conversation to have. Thank you both for at least having the courage to take part in such a volatile conversation potentially. Kim Iversen, you're going to stay with me for a continued conversation into the second hour of my show. But thank you for your contribution and your insights so far. That is it for the first hour of the Neil Oliver Show. But stay tuned for the brilliant Free Speech Nation, following on the old telly box. But we have extra content online carrying on. Kim Iversen is staying with me, plus the response to COVID in Canadian care homes with David Dixon, and what's gone wrong with legacy media with Ralph Schulhammer when we arrive at Schulhammer time. Don't miss that. I'll see you next week. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Let's get straight back into the conversation with podcast host Kim Iversen to discuss the latest political situation in the US. Are you still there, Kim?
I'm here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for staying with me. Kim, I can say with my hand on my heart, as one who loves the United States of America, wishes only the best for the American dream and the idea of America, it's with great heartache that I watch what is at the moment looking like a bad soap opera play out in terms of the political situation. Just most recently, what are we to make of the sudden pivot away from the Joe Biden that 5 minutes ago we were being told was bright as a button, sharp as a tack, to him now being sidelined, and Kamala Harris, that was previously no one's choice, is now being praised to the highest by everyone from the Obamas down. How do we read that?
Yeah, it's a wild world we're living in right now here in the United States. And it's just this idea that we live in this democracy and they promote this great democracy over here. But then we have to wonder exactly what is the state of the democracy when, for years now, these last several years, they've tried to do everything they can to prevent Trump from being the Republican nominee. They've done everything from drag him through courts, make him a convicted felon. They tried to actually remove him from the ballot. And now on the Democrat side, they just completely averted a Democratic primary process, trying to gaslight us all into believing that Joe Biden was just fine when everybody had been saying for the last couple of years that he's declining mentally. He even said when he ran that he would be a one-term president, that he understood he was getting older and he would pass the torch. Well, he wasn't really willing to do that in the end. He wanted to remain in that seat. But the thing that made it really the worst was that they just refused to have a democratic process entirely. And as you said, nobody's voted for Kamala. Not a single person has cast a vote for Kamala for president of the United States. She ran in 2020. She had to drop out of the primary race before a single primary because she wasn't popular. People weren't going to vote for her. So then they put her in as VP. And the thing I think to know is that to kind of clear up maybe some confusion as to why when Kamala ran in 2020, she received all of the Hillary Clinton apparatus. She received all of the donors from Hillary Clinton, the senior policy advisors, the campaign managers. Her sister, Maya, was one of the main senior policy advisors for Hillary Clinton. Of course, obviously, was advising Kamala Harris. So Harris inherited all of the Hillary Clinton apparatus. They put all of their eggs in the Kamala basket. And when the public didn't buy it, they thought for sure the public would. And when the public didn't, that left them a little bit scrambling. So they ensured she got that VP slot. And now they've ensured that she's the candidate. But she is the successor to Hillary Clinton. And we've all just been told that's what we have to accept, even without a single vote cast.
Do you think, I hear everything you're saying there about the weight of the machinery that was very swiftly swung into position behind her to propel her forward, but it didn't work. This time, are we to take with a straight face that the Democrats are serious about Kamala Harris, or do they have something else up their sleeves entirely? And this is just a space filler for the time being?
I think they're serious about Kamala Harris. I do think that because she has that Hillary Clinton machine behind her, the Clinton machine, that is their pick, and that is who they've invested in. They thought by putting her in as vice president, even though no one voted for her in the primaries, they thought maybe she'll ingratiate herself. People will start to really like her. They'll start to bond with her. It didn't work. That's what I'm most surprised about. I'm most surprised that even as she continued to lose support, actually, over the time as vice president, that they would still go forward with their original plan that they had back in 2019, which was that Kamala Harris would be the successor to Hillary Clinton. But that's just, that shows that there's a lot of disdain for the voting public, that they don't really care about what the voting public thinks, that they're going to push their agenda, and they've got their pick. And it's what we dealt with in 2016 also with Bernie Sanders running. They basically pushed him aside and said, no, it's her turn. As if we have, we've taken numbers and people have to wait in line for the presidency rather than actually voting. I mean, they made that very blatant in 2016. It's her turn. So they basically done that same thing to us this time around with, well, it's Kamala. We've decided Kamala's the one. And so whether you guys like it or not. And Democrats, they're just painting it like, well, anybody's better than Trump. So you'll take Kamala, even though you didn't get to vote for her because you just don't want Donald Trump.
Tom, listening to that, do you still look on at what's happening in Washington, in the States, and say that it's democracy in action?
I do, in the sense that, look, there have been, I think, 15 vice presidents that went on to become president. 8 because of the death of a president in office or an assassination, like in the case of JFK, and 4 went on to be later elected. And in fact, whilst I actually agree with what has been said about the shortcomings of this now Democratic nominee to be president, Kamala Harris, nevertheless, she was on the ticket. She was elected, if you think about it, because she was on the Biden-Harris ticket back in 2020. Now, there's an issue about the extent to which she can win the popular vote in the Electoral College in November. And frankly, from what I'm seeing, just talking as an observer, we don't have a dog in this particular Democratic fight. But I have to say, if she not only takes on the Hillary Clinton machine, but takes on the Hillary Clinton narrative, which is what she appears to be doing, almost like it's sort of basket of deplorables Mark II. I mean, look how she's defining her political strategy against Trump. She's saying, well, he's a convicted felon. I'm the prosecutor. I'm not sure that's going to really get traction with the kind of voters that she needs to win over in this election.
Kim, Kamala Harris, she had dreadful records in the Justice Department in California. She was not popular, as you've clearly stated, even with all the weight behind her. Are we seeing a different practice here? Was it the case that Biden was known to have dementia at least as early as 2019? The people were talking privately about his cognitive degeneration then. But it would appear that for the Democrats it was fine because they just needed a factotum, just someone there, and the real power would be behind the scenes. Are they now, with Kamala Harris, about to do something similar? It doesn't matter if she's useless, it doesn't matter if anyone likes her. As long as she's occupying the Oval Office, we'll just get on with business as usual, and it'll just be another run for Obama/Clinton.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they like her, I think, and that's why they're so afraid of Donald Trump, the establishment in general. And I mean both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat. There's a concerted effort on both sides to get rid of Donald Trump. There's a concerted effort in the establishment that's both Republican and Democrat that would like to see Kamala Harris instead of Trump. And I think it is because she's malleable. They can get her to say and do whatever they'd like. We saw that in the 2020 presidential primary when she was running. That's why she lost favor with the people. She kept flip-flopping. She was known for flip-flop. She'd get on the debate stage, say something, and then she'd get off the stage and she'd be interviewed and she'd say, well, okay, I need to clarify. I didn't really mean what I just said. And she did that over and over and over again, like her handlers were off the side of the stage and said, whoa, you can't say that. That's not actually in our agenda. So they like her because she's willing to go along with what the power players behind the scenes want. And I think that's why they really, it's really just anyone they can sell, they think, to the public, but who will do the job that they want done. And she has taken on the Hillary Clinton narrative. There's a bit of a battle between the Obamas and the Clintons. They're not totally aligned. They're not seeing eye to eye. The Obamas finally caved and just went ahead and endorsed Kamala today. But but it's not one and the same. But she is definitely from the Clinton camp.
For me, honestly, Kim, at least, for one thing, at least we will finally perhaps get to see what she means by what can be unburdened by what has been, which will clear something up that I think is very important for all of us. It's been lovely talking to you. I hope we'll talk again. My thanks to Kim Iverson, host of the brilliant Kim Iverson Show, for joining me on the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Next, we will hear from retired police officer David Dixon on concerns over the treatment of unvaccinated patients in Canadian care homes during the COVID pandemic. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. I want to speak now about concerns over the treatment of unvaccinated residents in Canadian care homes during the COVID pandemic. David Dixon, a retired Liverpool police officer and owner of a cybersecurity firm that's been instrumental in gathering government data, says he was told that a senior staff member at a care home in Edmonton stated that they would slow code any person who was unvaccinated, which means respond slowly or incompletely to a patient in cardiac arrest. I'm joined now by David Dixon to tell us more about what he learned about this. David, thanks for joining me.
Afternoon, Neil.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to you.
Speak to you.
Slow code. That's a very sinister sounding instruction. Can you elaborate a bit on how you came to understand that's having been the process in place?
Yeah. So just like you've been hearing in the Scottish inquiry from Twitter followers like Dave and Russler, over the last year or so, Canada went through the same process starting in 2020, locking down care homes, the fear ramping up to the point that healthcare staff were terrified to actually go in and deal with residents, even before we got to the vaccines. They were in hospitals, patients were left for hours upon a time, crashing with nurses saying, I'm not going in there, I might catch COVID. So willing to let people die. That sort of, as we got into the vaccine rollout, sort of exacerbated with not only, people who didn't wear a mask were considered pariahs of society, but if you didn't get vaccinated, you were, even worse. And there was one incident in Edmonton where an actual manager, a unit manager, was overheard and was not smart enough to realise that what she was saying was in an area that was covered by a camera, and actually said to another member of staff, if one of the unvaccinated residents, has an issue, then I'm quite happy to slow code them. And as you say, that actually means they would take the time, stand back and watch them die. Now, as a retired police officer, that's an intent to commit murder. I mean, there's no other way of putting that.
No, we haven't seen the audio and the video that to which you're referring. But so I mean, I have to and we don't have a response, a statement back from the care home in question. But I think the mere fact that a form of words had been decided upon, this slow code. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was reported, wasn't it? This was reported was it the October of 2021 that. Yes. Slow code was supposedly official response to people with cardiac arrest or unable to breathe, and that nothing was done.
So we're focusing on just one little aspect of all the things that went on in the care homes. Slow code is actually a term that's been used in healthcare for a long time, but it became sort of a relatively standard response for people who were, it's a way of choosing who lives and who dies. I suppose one of the things that it's important for people to understand is we're talking about this right now as like one incident and in the past tense. This isn't past tense. Once we finish this interview today, I'm heading up to the care home in Edmonton, which is on full COVID lockdown. Residents locked in their rooms, 25 residents in one unit, locked in their unit, behind closed doors, masks, face shields, goggles, gloves, gowns, sanitizer, restricted in and out, with 3 patients, one of them who doesn't even have symptoms. And that's still happening today. These are the things that happened in 2020 and 2021 are continuing to happen today. And because of this ongoing fear campaign that, you'll die if you don't get vaccinated, you'll die if you don't wear a mask, it's become ingrained across the world. If you actually look at the UK or Scotland's current protocols for care homes, they're identical to here. 2 cases, which is basically 2 people who sneeze in a 14-day period or 10-day period here, and they lock down the whole unit. Everybody in it is now restricted, as bad, if not worse, than they were in 2020. And that's what really killed people. Not just responding slowly, but actually locking them in their room, failure to thrive.
Bear with me, David. Tom Buick, here with me in London. It's as though it's fear and propaganda that's endemic, isn't it? If as David Dixon says, the policy is still, in the face of what we understand now is no more than a common cold, is still prompting this kind of reaction in Canadian care homes. How on earth do we get the population reprogrammed out of this?
Yeah, potentially it's very sinister, Neil, but I'm glad David just clarified, because I was a bit curious about this very sinister sounding word, slow code. I mean, it sounds like similar to do not resuscitate that you sometimes see on patients' records here in the UK, which, by the way, has also been controversial, right? Because there are times when families haven't been informed that their loved ones have this do not resuscitate on their medical records. But I think, just to pan out and take the bigger picture here, I think what's still really concerning for me is that this hangover from the lockdown period, and Canada was at the forefront of, frankly, some of these commercials that were, or public information films in the state province of Quebec that I saw, for example, literally saying to parents, if you don't get your kids vaccinated, the ghouls and the monsters are going to come out of their wardrobes and get them in the middle of the night. So there is some questions, I think, for Canada about how it responded during the lockdowns. And as we now know, the vaccine does not prevent transmission. The vaccine does not eradicate the disease. Therefore, a lot of the arguments that were circulating around at the time, and by the way, you were pointing out at the time, and people were saying you were wrong, turn out now to be the case. So I guess a question which I've got, which we could, if David could shed some more light on this, why aren't these protocols, why isn't the pressure on these protocols being pressure on them to change? Because in this country now, if you get COVID, you can still go into work, you don't have to self-isolate. Why isn't the regime around COVID management changing?
David Dixon, I'm sure you were hearing that Tom's comments there. Is the majority of the Canadian population on message with this, or is there across the board COVID fatigue? Let's just put this where it belongs, which is, we no longer have to behave in this way, and there are much more important questions to be asked about, the actions that were taken, the legislations that were put in place, the experimental gene therapies that were all but mandated for whole swathes of populations.
Yeah, so the biggest problem is that the majority of the population doesn't know this is still happening. We have a weekly dashboard, and yesterday I did the data for Alberta, as I do for all countries. And we've reported, it's been reported in Alberta that there's been over 700 COVID deaths since October. Now, those COVID deaths are defined as anybody who dies for any reason within 60 days of being put into the system as a COVID case. Even the COVID case is a bit, it's based on what you call lateral flow tests, we call RAT tests, rapid antigen tests. So you had 28 days. We have 60 days here. We've had 150 flu deaths and over 700 COVID deaths, but nobody is talking about it. And behind the scenes, in the hospitals and in the care homes, these COVID restrictions, which are actually more restrictive now, but they're not general. So I'll be going to the care home this afternoon. There'll be a sign at the front door saying one of the units is on lockdown. But other than that, if you wander around the units, you wouldn't know that COVID even existed or anything existed. Everything that is going on is normal. People are walking around, no masks, no nothing, until you get to the unit that's on outbreak. And this is the same in hospitals. You suddenly hit a wall, a locked fire door, which is illegal in itself. And you can't go through that door unless you put on a mask and a face shield and gowns and gloves and hand sanitizer. And I mean, I was locked out of the care homes despite being my mother-in-law's medical proxy for 1,193 days because I can't physically wear a mask. I've got a medical exemption and everything. I've got pulmonary fibrosis. And I actually used to sit in the car park in the middle of the Canadian winters at minus 45, talking to the doctor inside the building about my mother-in-law's medical care because I wasn't allowed in the building. I mean, this didn't even get to vaccinated or not. I mean, they, in some centres, they included vaccinations, but this is as bad as masks. And right now, officially, if I go in, I'm not, there's a sign on the door of one of the units that says nobody beyond these doors without a mask and a face shield. Now, I've met with this CEO of Capital Care, the largest care home group in Alberta and one of the largest in North America, and told them you can't do that. It's illegal.
David, I'm going to just have to jump in for shortage of time, but I cannot stress to you the extent to which I think it's so important that you've brought this to my attention. So important that this insanity is endemic in Canada and that more people don't know about this lingering after effect about people behaving in the wrong way and continuing, like here, to fail to ask the relevant questions. Thank you, David Dixon, for joining us today.
It's still it's still happening in the UK and Scotland as well. It's not just here.
It's so important that you turn that light on it. Thank you so much, David Dixon. For the rest of us back here in the UK, don't go away, because coming up, it's Ralph Schulhammer. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all of the children are above average. My final guest, as is becoming a habit, is lecturer, commentator and thinker. That's what he is most of all, thinker Ralph Schulhammer. Ralph, are you there?
Thanks to be. Great to be on with you, Neil, again.
Oh, I look forward to this, Ralph. You're always what I need at the moment when you arrive. It's perfect. I know because I'm pre-warned that the hypothesis you're developing this week, it's reflective of what I'm, I suppose, aware of, which is the upside down, inside out, back to front nature of our society at the moment, where wrong is right, black is white. Take it away from there.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think we're living through a period of the most successful brainwashing operation in human history. And my main thesis is that for the last 30 years, we have been told that radicals are moderates and that moderates are radicals. And I give you one example. I was listening to your previous guest who talked about Canada. And Canada is a beautiful example. Justin Trudeau was not a moderate politician. Think about COVID. Think about the truckers. Think about hate speech laws. Think about how they dragged our friend Mark Steyn through, I think, 3 different quote-unquote human rights tribunals. Now, this was all authoritarian stuff, but somehow in the media, Trudeau was always presented as this liberal, well-intended, moderate politician who is successfully fighting against the threat from the right. And I think we see this in the United States. We see it in continental Europe. Look at Ursula Ursula von der Leyen and the program she has put together for the European Commission. This is not a moderate program. And I have a couple of other examples as well. But in general, this, I think, has been the big misunderstanding of the last couple of years, that those who are called radical are very often the moderates, and those who are called moderates are very often the radicals. I'm so
glad that you used the term brainwashing. I spent decades wondering how certain behaviours in mass populations had ever been achieved. We've only got to look back at whatever happened in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. What happened in Russia. In the wake of the 1917 revolution, and then post Second World War and into the Cold War, I used to think, how did they get people to do that? Because it seems to stand on its head anything that most people would accept was reasonable behaviour. But with the last couple of years having gone by, I don't ask that question of myself anymore because I've seen it with my own eyes.
No, I think you're correct. And actually, I think even the comparison you make is absolutely appropriate. Let me give you just a handful of examples, what happened in recent days. So there was this website, it still exists, it's called GovTrack. And what they basically do is they rate politicians by their leanings left or right in the United States. And in 2019, they published a rating for senators in the United States, right, where you have 100 senators. And it turned out that by their behavior in Congress, Kamala Harris was the most left-leaning senator of the United States, even more left-leaning than Bernie Sanders. She was number 100 out of 100 senators. Now, what did they do 2 days ago? They deleted that section from their homepage because it would hurt Kamala Harris in her election chances. Or another example would happen the same thing. As you remember, in 2021, Joe Biden made Kamala Harris the border czar, so basically the point person for everything that's happening regarding immigration. For 3 years, every media, CNN, Axios, all of them called her the border czar. 2 days ago, the same media came out and said, she was never really the border czar. This is just an invention by the right-wing media. Then they were confronted with the fact that they called it that themselves. So they made little editor notes below and said, well, we incorrectly called her the border czar for 3 years. This is, you're absolutely correct in your comparison. This is Stalinesque stuff, right? This is, if you remember after the purges, when you had the black and white pictures of Stalin and a couple of guys, and those who were killed, they were all of a sudden, they disappeared from the photographs. This is what the media is doing now, with one difference, I have to say, that in the 1930s, this was imposed by the state. What we see happening now is that the media does it voluntarily. So we kind of have, in the cultural media environment, a quote-unquote voluntary subjugation to a new form of totalitarianism. And that, I find, is the big difference and the big surprise. I mean, Hitler and Stalin, they must shake their heads down in hell or wherever they are, when they say, we had to build this huge totalitarian secret police, intimidating states. And if you look nowadays, the media is actually doing it voluntarily. Or a topic that you talk luckily a lot about, think back to COVID. I mean, everything we see happening, it's kind of, the media is acting, the politicians are acting as if all the things they said 4 years ago, as if that has never happened.
Tom, did you ever think you'd live to see such days? I mean, what Ralph's describing is, it's Orwellian, it's 1984, it's Brave New World, it's memory holing, it's double speak, it's all of those things. What was so yesterday is not so today, and furthermore, not to mention that it wasn't so yesterday. Did you think you'd ever get here?
I mean, look, as an academic by background, I could, like you, Neil, I could listen to Ralph all day, and absolutely, I mean, there's an incredible irony, I think, about the times in which we live in. I mean, I remember actually visiting just a few years ago the Stasi Museum in Berlin, what was the old East Berlin, and they were making a big thing in the museum about how the state was surveilling people, and these sort of quite gimmicky cameras that were put in Trabants and shoeboxes that were spying on neighbours. Yet, when you wake up in the morning, the surveillance now in our society, we know from the Snowden files and what happened there, the way in which, this group collection of data because of the digital age in which we live in. I think part of the reason for this, and obviously this segment was about, the normalisation of groupthink, is we've got a kind of way of governance now across the West, which is sort of technocratic centralism is what I call it. So the technocrats who are really in charge of the sort of day-to-day running of the country, they are also aware, because of the politicians they serve, of the narratives that are being served up to the population by the media. So it creates this sort of cycle, this feedback loop, I think, where the technocrats feel under pressure for the narratives that have been created, and therefore come out not with more pluralism or try to be accountable for the decisions they're making. They just make more and more authoritarian sort of decisions. I mean, that's my take on the theory, that sort of technocratic centralism that we're seeing across the West.
Ralph, you're reminding me of all sorts. You know, I'm minded of, you know, the Milgram experiments, you know, where people were duped into thinking that they were giving up to and including lethal electric shocks to people that they couldn't see but they could hear, but they were being reassured all the time by men and women in white coats purporting to be doctors that it was okay because they were doing what they were told by people in authority. And so they were prepared to set aside their own morality and ethics and deliver what would have been lethal electric shocks. And then there's that experiment where people were unknowingly the only people in an experiment that weren't in on the trick, and two lines of two different lengths were put on a blackboard, and people were invited to say, are they different lengths or are they the same? And everyone who was in on the trick said no, they are exactly the same length. And the dupe, the mark, the only person who didn't know, could plainly see that there were two different lengths, but decided to go with the majority decision, you know, assuming that there must be something wrong with himself. And yet, with all that background knowledge that we have about our susceptibility, we've found ourselves here again.
No, I think you're right, and I think Tom put it beautifully, and I fully agree with everything he said, particularly the part about the narrative, and you can connect this with the part about the Milgram experiment, right? One of the reasons why people did what they did in that experiment is because they felt that, you know, you had the guys in the white lab coats who said, oh, no, it's fine, you can do this, don't worry about it. And this is precisely what we have today as well. You see something on the BBC, you see something on CNN, and there's a voice where you say, wait a moment, that can't be true, right? That doesn't sound right. But then you think, no, but they have been the trusted media for the last 40, 50, 60, or in the case of the BBC, you can say the last 80 years. So even though they say, I exaggerate slightly, they say 3 times 3 is 10, there is this part of you that says, I know it's not true, but if they say it might be. And I think this is the situation we find ourselves in today. But the good news is, right, there is now, and I mean this in a positive way, there is no alternative media. There is the possibility for you, Neil, for Tom, for me, kind of that we talk critical about these things. Now, I think the three of us are always very open about what we think. Whatever our agenda is, I think most people know what it is, so there is no, we don't try to say what we say is super objective. We say, okay, here are the facts and here's our interpretation. But as Tom correctly pointed out, these days it's like they present their interpretation as the facts. I mean, I think COVID was the best example for this. That I remember they have now published the protocols of the institutions that are responsible for COVID policy in Germany. And this is absolutely shocking, right? I mean, they knew, and I think it was the same in Britain, they knew the limits of what masking, the positive effects, if any, of masking. They knew what's going to happen socially in schools. Like, they knew all of this. They knew about the vaccinations. And they still told us their interpretation as if it was the truth. But I think that more and more people are onto them, let's put it this way. And I feel this is a little bit also the obligation that the three of us, and particularly Neil, because you have done yeoman's work in this area, kind of really try to, tell the people that, listen, very often your gut feeling, not all the time, but very often your gut feeling is right, and don't be afraid to listen to it, so to speak.
Tom, I noticed that something significant had happened to me just in the last couple of weeks, because my wife said to me, it's the Olympics. She said, it's the Olympics in Paris. And I had no idea. It passed me by because I'm not consuming the mainstream media. And likewise, I completely missed Wimbledon. The preeminent tennis competition on the planet, and one that I used to watch. I used to cheer on Andy Murray or Bjorn Borg or whatever in different times. Missed it completely. And so I think you're right. It's right that you highlight the alternative media that's there, Ralph. I only watch what is now bracketed as alternative media. And I'm missing out on the bread and circuses. I'm not seeing, for good or ill, I'm unaware of Strictly Come Dancing, and I'm unaware of, any of that stuff that I used to know about. I'm living in an alternative universe.
Well, or in reality, one could say, as you said, I hate this comparison because everybody uses it, but I do it nonetheless. You stepped out of the matrix, and I think with the communications that we have here, the conversations we have here, I hope will encourage other people to do the same. I mean, don't get me wrong. Honestly, if things would be as I like them, I would live in this bread and circus world. If I think back to the 90s, I always think, my God, what a great time the 90s were. Right? I mean, at least it appeared to be such a worry, at least in the West, let's put it this way, it appeared to be such a worry-free period, but it's no longer the case. And a last point on this is, which I think is also crucial, I just have increasingly a sense that those in power, whether it's in politics or media, I just believe honestly that they don't have the best interest of the majority of the people at heart. I think they have their own ideological agenda. I think they have these high and mighty delusional visions of whether it's saving the planet or creating their multicultural utopia. And I think that on the way to whatever they imagine, whatever utopia they envision, it's just going to get us closer and closer to dystopia. And I mean this sincerely, right? This is not trying to be hyperbolic here, but in all areas, from the economy, from environmentalism, to migration, to bureaucracy, to, as Tom said, I think so correctly, to the technocracy, none of this is working in a positive way for a majority of the people. Again, I would be glad if it would work, but it doesn't. And I think it's important to point that out.
Tom.
But in terms of how we might fix this malaise then, Ralph, I mean, I think back actually to the 19th century. You may be aware of the Chartist movement here in the United Kingdom, actually first won manhood suffrage in terms of working class people getting the vote without the property qualification, and eventually that was followed up in 1928 with women getting the vote. But only 5 of the 6 demands that the Chartists made were met, which of course was a social revolution at the time. The one demand they had, though, of our democracy here in Britain was that there should be elections every year. And the reason why they advanced that proposition was the notion of, if you allow your representatives to get too comfortable in power with all the trappings of state, they could see that even back in the 19th century, that's when this corruption with a small c and a large c potentially will creep in. And I do wonder whether we've got to get back to looking at, mechanisms of accountability in our democratic discourse, and how do we improve that democratic deficit that quite clearly we see?
No, I think you're correct. And I think that the steps into this direction, I think one is that we have to take back certain responsibilities from unnamed or unknown bureaucracies. I think this has been a big issue, again, in Europe, the United States and Great Britain, but you make another very important point. And I think you're so right. And one thing is exactly this, when we look at accountability, is I always reminded of this interview that Keir Starmer gave, and maybe he was taken out of context, so I don't want to be unfair to him. But when he was asked, whether he prefers Westminster or Davos, and he, basically shooting from the hip immediately said Davos. And it's not because he said Davos, but it's about, we have completely inversed, I think, the idea of politics, which is no longer to have an effect on your immediate community, right? So you represent as an MP a certain part of the United Kingdom, and you wanted to get the best out for that part of the United Kingdom. It's this is just seen as a stepping stone then to being even beyond the United Kingdom, right? So the actual crowd you play to is not your constituency, wherever you came from, but it is, the postmodern, cosmopolitan Davos crowd, and this bothers me a little bit.
Yeah,
but
actually,
I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of that, it was on the BBC in the last year or so, referring to the country of Turkey as Turkia in its coverage, and that's fine. I mean, go to Turkey, that's how it's referred to. If you go to your country, it's not Germany, it's Deutschland. But why does our national broadcaster have to sort of pander to, as you say, to that cultural elite that says, please refer to us as Turkia in your national output? It's a very odd thing to do, do you not think?
No, you're right. And I think it brings us back to such a crucial thing, right, Neil, that we have talked about previously. Is if you create the impression, again, I'm slightly exaggerating, but I think it's not entirely wrong. If you create the impression that the only thing that gives true meaning to life is if you have a global impact, I mean, that's extremely discouraging for the average person. We have completely devalued those who engage in local communities, those who engage, in social work, in small things, in small stuff. But I'm with Tolstoy on this, right? If you read Anna Karenina, basically the entire book is about how important the small things in life are. You don't have to be the 2 million followers Instagrammer or the president of the European Commission. I think that you can add a lot of value to the people in your life on a small scale, but this can have an impact that lasts for a lifetime. And I think we have to put value back into these kind of things. This is, there was this old saying, I think it was Greenpeace, that said, think globally, act locally. But I think we have now completely inversed this. We are thinking globally, and we are no longer acting at all locally. I mean, just as a quick point on this, this is for me the big insanity about the climate discussion. Whatever you think about climate change, and I'm open to a debate here, but the idea that a country, like in the United Kingdom, like in the United States, like in many countries in continental Europe, that has trouble, and we saw this in Germany, for example, during the Euro Championship, a country that has trouble to provide the basic services the state is supposed to provide. But then its politicians and representatives go out and say, we cannot make the train runs on time, but the global climate, that we can solve. Yes. That's just insanity. This is just insanity.
To sign up, for so many of them to be ready to sign up to Agenda 2030, which by any metric condemns uncountable numbers of the poorest people in the world, well, to suffering and death, and yet it's pitched as the humane and good and green thing to do. I mean, if that isn't the textbook example of the kind of, presenting radical policy as something reasonable, yes, then I don't know what is.
I agree, right? And this is, you could argue, and I mean, there's a lot of debate about it going on, but in a certain way, this is, akin to eugenics on a global scale, as you said, and it is nothing different. If you refuse reliable energy, if you refuse development to 4 or 5 billion people on the planet, they have less access to medical treatment, they have less access to clean water, they have less access to hygiene, which means that they're condemned to either die in childbirth, to die as small children, or have significantly shorter lives than the rest of the world. I'm just saying, there is a word for this. If your politics deliberately lead to mass starvation, mass suffering, and potentially mass death, I'm saying that there's a word for that, that we use in many other contexts, but when it comes to these policies, apparently nobody is willing to use the word genocide, but to some extent it is. If we would follow the prescriptions of the radical environmentalists like Last Generation or Just Stop Oil, you would have, in the name of environmentalism, a form of a genocide with millions, if not billions, of people dying. And that's not an exaggeration, just the last number of this, right? Half the world depends on artificial fertilizer to grow their crops. If you ban artificial fertilizer, which depends on fossil fuels to be produced, you condemn 4 billion people to death. I mean, I really don't know what other term to use.
It is endemic insanity, Ralph, but in this mad world where we are, so far from Kansas, Toto, I look to you as a lifeline leading all the way back towards the common sense insanity of old. Thank you, Ralph. That's all we've got time for.
Thanks, Neil.
You've been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thanks to all my guests, especially to Tom. We'll be back next week. Be there. You know it makes sense.